This is going to be a bit of a year in review episode here, but I do have some really important things to say. You know, along the way in this first season of the Neutral Ground podcast, I got to speak with some amazing people, and they all began the same way.
I have got Dr. Matthew Jacobson,
Lori Singer, Nick Gibson, my friend of 25 years, Scott Hyam, Amanda Huffman, Ben Killoy, Dr. Tim Overton, Matt Monroe, the great DC Glenn, PJ Weary, Dr. Kimberly Max Brown, Dr. Sheila Murnahan, David Fishoff, with Dr. Alex Hershaft. Welcome to the Neutral Ground. I believe wholeheartedly that anybody who comes on my show should always feel welcomed and invited. Now, I did have some difficulties along the way. Nick, thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Happy to have you on. Sorry, I pulled that.
It's totally fine. It's great. Uh-oh.
Did we lose Max?
I think we did. Modern technology here.
Oh.
I don't know why. It may be a break in the in internet access, but
yeah, I think she might be coming back.
There we go.
There we go.
You are.
I don't know what happened, but I got pushed out.
Now, don't get me wrong. I also had some highlights as well. I learned that you have a bachelor's, right, in communication, but you had a focus in theater. Now,
he's done his research.
Absolutely, because I've
been meaning to get this off my chest the whole conversation, but sprinkles.
Thank you. You just made my wife's day. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Hershaft, I can't think of a better way to end this than on that note that we all, for meaning, we have to go out and you can't just believe in good, you have to do it. You have to do good. Thank you so much. This was absolutely, truly an honor to sit here with you and listen to your story.
My pleasure. It was probably the most stimulating podcast I've done.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much for that. Something that I strive for, and I will continue to strive for with this show, is to try to continue to model civil discourse about important issues, like exposing the darkness within humanity, working on our mental health, exploring how we can help our veterans more, finding meaning when we need it most in life, understanding celebrity culture, and breaking down how we communicate with each other. What follows are just some of my favorite moments from the first season. If you want to check out the full episode of a particular discussion, you can use the timestamps in the episode notes below for reference. Now, if you're watching this on my YouTube channel, which I encourage anyone who has not yet subscribed to it to do so, you already know when a new conversation is starting from the screen in front of you. However, for my podcast listeners on audio-only platforms, I'm going to play the following sound. I'm going to use that to indicate when I'm moving on to a new conversation, just so things don't blend together too much. Now, if I've provided any moments of thoughtfulness or levity to you, consider hitting the subscribe/follow button and leave me a kind rating or review where applicable. I'm trying to get this message of hopefulness and civil discourse to more people, and you can certainly help with a few clicks of the mouse and keyboard. Finally, I've got a special message at the end of the episode as well. Until then, enjoy these moments from the first season of the Neutral Ground podcast.
And that exchange in particular, I think, it's entertaining. It's kind of, I'm glad I had that preface first, but it's an entertaining banter because you have Bill Burr, this legendary roaster, on the spot comedian who can just, I think I mentioned in the dissertation, but he's sort of became really famous after this rant. I forget,
in Philadelphia.
Yeah, where he just roasted. He just roasted an audience for his entire set time in a really knowledgeable ways of Philadelphia things and sort of became this superstar because of it. And he's amazing at ranting. And when he gets fired up, you're like, oh, this is going to be so good because he's just gonna say something, and he did, in the exchange where it's like, wow, this is these are hilarious. Like, oh, you're so tough with your open nose and throat or whatever.
Yes, that line at the toward the end of that exchange, and they talk about, of course, masculinity and something that you had mentioned before, right? About, again, these ideas of mediums and picking up different kind of communicative data points, right?
Yeah.
As I'm listening to it, like most people do, what I'm not getting 100% of is when Rogan initiates the conversation. If you watch him, the video of it on, let's say, YouTube or Spotify, wherever it is now, if you look at his face, you can tell that he's just trying to start something. And there's a point there where he knows that he can push his friend's button. But you don't get that, I think, initially when you just listen in the audio. It becomes, I think, clearer later on because, Rogan starts to laugh and this and that. But that initial mask question where he says very flatly, very seriously about, let's get into it. Let's talk about it. You're thinking, oh, there's a tense moment there for a minute where you're like, oh, something is about to happen between two giants here. Yeah. We're going to see, it's like, King Kong versus Godzilla. It's a Titan war all of a sudden, right? Where you're like, oh boy, what's going to happen here? That idea. And I thought your point about the rhetoric of masculinity there, and this is where I'm going to quote you here because I thought it was fascinating. You mentioned that Newsweek, after hearing that, there was a lot of blowback against Rogan for that exchange and particularly. And you had mentioned that someone like Newsweek had written a piece on it and had laid out facts that kind of went against what Rogan was saying. But you added something to the end here. You added a possible problem. You said, in fact, highlighting, which is what they were trying to do, the dangers of coronavirus may have the opposite effect, leading such audiences to believe that not wearing a mask is even more masculine and brave, possibly even heroic, because of the undeniable danger. And I thought, that's fascinating, how trying to provide elements of facts, they're thinking maybe they can undercut what Rogan is saying, and you're sort of saying, well, that might not actually work. It might even be worse. So can you clarify and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And that's more of I don't have concrete, studies or anything that would say that that's the case, or I can't cite any at the moment. But it kind of points this issue with communication, right? When someone is going in and saying, just, all right, we're laying out facts in this article, right? And we're going to debunk something or just point it out. In some ways, it's kind of, I don't want to say that it's like totally moot, because I think people do learn, but the people who are reading that article based on the headline already have their ideas about mask wearing and its effectiveness, right? So having all these facts useful, but is not going to really do much to convince people who are skeptical, right? Who are skeptical of traditional media, which Rogan's podcast is an alternative to in some ways. But yeah, there's so many reasons that people who don't wear masks rhetorically could argue for not wearing them, right? It's if it's not brave because it's because there's some real danger out there, then it's brave because people are going to judge you for it. It's just kind of this contrarian thing, like, oh, I'm not concerned about other people's opinions of me. I'm going to keep going and behaving this way, in spite of them. And in fact, that might fuel me. And if I do believe in the science of it, well, then I'm confident in my immune system, because I take all these vitamins that Rogan sells through On It, that I will be totally protected against this virus, and I have no reason to worry. So I'm being tough by being willing to test my faith and my confidence in my own body in this performative way in public. So you just never know.
Hearing that story can have an uplifting effect on all of us. to a degree. And that's what I like about the whole connection of narrative here in general, the way you narrated from beginning to end, including the wonderful ending stories, which were fantastic to read. The results that happened were wonderful. Well, let me ask you this then, because it's an important question. We all have, to a degree, anxiety, right? And in some ways, it's built into us from evolution, even, right? So where do you see professionally the line between, let's call it a normal level of anxiety, for a lack of better term, just for clarity here, normal level, when does it become a problem that must be addressed?
Yes, we all have anxiety, that's for sure. I mean, I have anxiety still myself, but I'm able to control it because I put it in perspective. It's when we can't control it, when it starts to consume our thoughts, when it starts to affect our lives, either socially, with our job, with our education, our outside life, with our relationships to others, when it starts to affect us in that way, or become to where we ourselves feel like it's overwhelming, these negative thoughts, then we need to seek help. Because what's interesting is when people come to see me, they don't realize what I have to instill in them is that self-confidence that you really are in control of what you think. They don't believe that they are. They don't believe that they can control what they think. They can stop themselves and say, hey, I am not going to let you come into my mind. That's it. You're going out. They've given up and they've just let that negative thought process take over. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, absolutely. Right. I mean, because I guess, even I had anxiety about anytime I'm beginning an interview, I'm anxious, about it, but it didn't prevent me from logging on, saying hello to you and starting this interview. However, could I envision a point where it could for someone? Of course, absolutely. And you can imagine how even just, one time leading to two, leading to three and four, and now you have a real pattern, right? You mentioned patterns in the book. You have a real pattern that you start to become comfortable with, of avoiding that particular moment, and how something that I see just every semester with young freshman college students is how quickly that pattern can build and become something much more. And correct me if I'm wrong. The more you wait, I would imagine, the more difficult it becomes, because we're patternistic. We're a patternistic species, really. Is that correct? Am I assuming too much?
No, that is 100% correct. It's 100% correct. There's two things here. And one is that the longer you engage in a behavior, the harder it is to change. I mean, that's just a fact. You can think of smoking cigarettes. I mean, if somebody came in to see me and they said, hey, I've been smoking for 30 years, I want to quit, I'd say, okay, great. And I'd write a plan. It's going to be more difficult for them to quit than if somebody else came in an hour later and say, hey, I want to quit smoking. I just started 6 months ago. Well, typically the person that started 6 months ago is going to have a much easier time than the person that started 30 years ago. And I did talk about in my book too, how when I was experiencing anxiety, which then turned into panic attacks, or I wouldn't drive on the freeway. And how realistic is that when you live in Southern California, especially my job at the time, to travel from house to house. So that I had to get that taken care of right away, because I wasn't going to be able to continue working if I wasn't going to go on the freeway.
Yeah, a very real life example. And something else then that you mentioned in the book, this particular section as well, I'll read it here because I thought it was really powerful, which was you talk at one point about when they first kind of enter the office with you, right? And you say, we can all agree that we want to solve this problem, right? So are we all willing to commit to participation in the work at hand? And then you say this moment is always key. I try whenever possible, to get a verbal yes from everyone. Why is it important for you to get a verbal or vocal yes in that moment?
So it's interesting that you say that, because there's typically, when a family comes in, it could be just the mother and child or a couple. There's always one that's skeptical, no matter how large the group is. And so I can typically read body language and just pick out the one who is not really on board. So then I will tell them, like, if it was you, I'd say, Joe, are you in agreement? So I'll call people out and I'll say, okay, I need for you to look at me and let me know, are you going to buy into this? Are you going to be a part of it? Because it's really important that you do. And then you might say, well, we've tried therapy before and just isn't going to work. But my mom told me I had to come, or she wouldn't let me watch videos or something. So at least if you're on it, I'd say, well, I appreciate your honesty. That's great. But I need to know that you're going to at least try, and we'll go from there.
What do you think it is about that particular storyline in humanity that we keep returning to it? This idea of needing to find purpose.
Well, it all kind of comes back to the eternal question: what is the meaning of life? And to be perfectly frank, the answer is whatever you want it to be. That's my personal opinion anyway. And that's every person who's ever lived has at one point asked themselves the question: what is the meaning of life? What is my purpose for being on this floating rock in space? There's nothing more tragic than a meaningless existence. We want to believe that our time on this planet had meaning,
Yeah, and there's a almost a special kind of horror in having that meaningless existence, right? Like in some ways, many of us, if not all of us, have had moments maybe where we've questioned our purpose or what is the purpose, let's say. And I think we can all agree that those are not particularly good moments for us, right? Purpose drives us to be better, to look for better things in ourselves and better things in each other as well. I'm curious.
It's the reason why so many people join cults or... Oh, sorry, I was talking over you.
No, you're good. We can go in that way as well. It connects very much with what we're saying too, this idea of cults, because what is it that cults are able to do for people is provide story, right? And purpose.
Provide meaning, provide existence, provide community. And cult leaders particularly prey on those type of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's strong. It's such a strong pull when you don't have meaning in your life. If for anyone who can offer you, we'll use the term easy access to meaning. If someone can offer that to you, we can certainly understand why someone would take it. And so I think you're right that maybe also what we're talking about here too is that pull of narrative structure and meaning is so powerful that we are willing, many of us, to give up our own personal narratives and structures if we have someone there who can provide maybe a more stable one in the moment.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I was thinking of how I think Norm even says in an interview with Mark Maron how he doesn't actually like abstractness. Like he likes to he doesn't think like that. It's almost like when he speaks, he wants to get very clear to the point where it's not this, innuendo or this type of talk where it's like when he's speaking and when he says something, it's very like, oh, Norm's saying this, and he doesn't like mince words,
Mm-hmm.
It's like he doesn't actually, and he doesn't, like Chappelle will do a great job of painting a story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where there's a lot of, like you see in construction, where I think Norm's constructing too, but it's almost like he takes like shortcuts in a way to get to his point. He's just like, I'm going to say this, and kind of just let the audience like just hit the audience, and then either the audience will laugh,
mm-hmm.
or the audience will go like they'll just drop their jaw a little bit, which I think goes back to why he might, your argument is you don't think he's a comedian's comedian.
Yeah,
because
I don't.
He might not appeal. Yeah, could you explain that a little?
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying, and I'm struggling with this still, which is why it's coming across exactly the way it is in my head right now, which is a little bit in disarray, because I'm struggling to try to explain exactly why it's hitting me in a weird way. I guess because, and again, I'll just use someone like Chappelle as an example. I kind of feel like he's more of a stand-up comedian's comedian in the vein of someone like Chappelle or Seinfeld, someone who not even just respected, but they respect what it takes to not simply write a joke, but all of them, what they do is they write and think about how is the audience consuming every word? And that is not, that's not something that you see in every stand-up comedian. It just isn't. There are times when you have throwaway words and throwaway lines in stand-up comedy, right? Like, and we don't pay too much attention to it all the time, as long as we get a good joke at the end. But with someone like Norm and Chappelle and Seinfeld, these people who construct and interact with the audience, the minds, that's the kind of comedian that I think of who would truly kind of say, we've lost someone here in that vein. Because and I'll bring this up, not for controversy reasons, but just to bring it up, on the Joe Rogan podcast with Chappelle, Rogan was talking about his friend Andrew Schulz, and he brought up the type of comedy that Schulz does online, and Chappelle, in a very respectful way, he literally says, with all due respect, and he means it, he says, "That's not what I do." And there's something about that moment when you can feel that Chappelle is really trying to say, don't put him in the same category as me, not in some human way as if Chappelle feels better than Andrew Schulz, but in a genre way of comedy. Like, I am a stand-up comedian. I write jokes. I write purposeful language, and I try to lead my audience on a journey with each joke. And of course, Rogan does the same thing. In that moment, Rogan is trying to be a really good friend to his friend Andrew Schulz, and that's fine. I get that. But I also know, because Rogan does take his time in writing out, he talks about writing a lot as a craft. Rogan probably also felt in that moment, okay, I get it. Let me not push this. I'm not going to push this idea because it is a different genre of stand-up comedy. And I think that's what I'm getting at. I'm hearing a lot of comedians say, he's a comedian's comedian. And part of me wants to just say, well, he's a certain type of comedian's comedian, I think. And I'm not even sure if I'm right. I'm not going to claim to be right. I'm not going to claim to have some sort of grand point here. It was just something that every so often someone will say in these Norm videos where they're talking about him passing away, that always makes me go, really? You're claiming him too? I want to just give you some space and some freedom to just kind of talk about how you're personally narrating and making sense or processing this drawdown and the ends of the Iraq-Afghanistan wars. How are you kind of navigating that and making sense of it yourself, being someone who was deployed to Afghanistan?
So I kind of had forgotten, not that the war was going on, but I guess I kind of felt like we were just going to always be there. I never really saw an end of the war. And so even when President Trump was talking about leaving, I was like, something's going to happen and they're going to say, no, we need to stay. And so when they actually left, when the U.S. actually left, I was kind of surprised and I wasn't quite ready to deal with all the emotions that I felt, because I deployed in 2010 to Afghanistan, and even then, I knew that if we left Afghanistan, that things would unravel rather quickly, just by the basis of talking to my translators that I worked with when I was over there and their feelings about Afghanistan. I remember one of the translators, he was talking about how Afghanistan, how your country is supposed to be like your mother and it's supposed to protect you. And he said he felt abandoned by his country. And he was really smart and educated. He knew English and Dari and Pashto. And he was just working with the Americans because he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. And he had, even in 2010, he didn't have any desire to stay and make the country better. He just felt betrayed. And that conversation has gone over. And I mean, I hadn't really thought about it in 10 years. And then when everything was falling apart and the people were, the Taliban was taking over, I just kept thinking about how even 10 years ago, he kind of already told me and the other engineer I was with that it was all going to fall apart. And so that story and that conversation kind of has been going over and over in my mind. And then another interpreter that I was connected with through Facebook, that we've stayed connected on social media, and he was stuck in Afghanistan. And so talking to him via Messenger and getting updates about the fear and the danger, he sent me pictures and he told me that they were hiding in their basement. And I was able to help donate money to a specific organization that he was working with, and he's now in the United States. And so I feel like I didn't do enough, but I also feel like we gave money to him and his family and they were able to get out. And that was kind of all we could afford to do. So I kind of been focusing on like helping that one person or his family. So it's more than one person, and how that was really important. But I also feel guilty because I feel like not everybody got out and there was so much other stuff going on. And I've had people contact me that I don't actually know, who just know I deployed to Afghanistan, and they're like desperate for help. And I can't help them, and it really makes it hard to be in the situation that I am. So finding the right boundaries, and there's a lot going on, if you can't tell.
But I want to go towards an idea of what you hit on, of being almost a purposeful mission to pursue the life within the home, that I like to break down the word integrity. It's hung all over corporate America as a core value, but it's not really broken down in the right sense of how we need to show up in a whole version. So within integrity, there's a root word integer. Integer in mathematics is a whole number. It's unfractioned. So to have structural integrity in your life, you need to have a whole life. Because a fraction life is going to be a house of cards that maybe has 2x4s on one side of the building and steel structures on the other. And no matter how many floors you're going to build, that one side is just going to crash. So your integrity, how much whole version are you showing up as, is actually determining like how much of life you can lift. Because if you have a lopsided idea of it and you're living fraction, you're only showing up as one version, you can't actually experience all of the areas of life. And eventually all of those, I think this is why we have such a high divorce rate, because many men are living a fraction life because that's what they were told to do. And when the Industrial Revolution and people were told to go off into the workplace, and that was almost where like the Plato's idea of the modern world is, that's where men are meant to go instead of the battlefield to fight the neighboring tribes. It's go provide for your family, but there still is a component of a wholeness that you still need to be this whole version. And one thing that I want to, you probably will get a good kick out of this. I didn't have any appreciation for it in English literature in sophomore year, but Plato's allegory of the cave, the ability to watch the world against the cave and not be able to see what's actually creating the shadows. That allegory, man, if that doesn't speak to a lot of the problems of what we have, because people are watching the illusion of their life through their eyes. And what people don't really realize connected to that is how you see the world is how you see your life. And those two are connected. And you can't see the world as a bright, abundant place of joy if you don't yet see your life as an abundant place of joy. These two are existentially linked. And most people don't even pause, even in this case, to turn around and see what's behind me. It's all about the illusion that's on the screen because that's all I was told I could look at. And that's how I've learned to see the world.
Absolutely. 2 weeks ago, we went over Plato's allegory of the cave, and we talked about, similarly to what you just mentioned, we talked about the prisoners who are chained and just staring at the shadows. And we even talked about the idea of how sometimes people feel a little bit too comfortable just being there, chained up, and how you can actually learn to love that life, being chained up and just watching the shadows, and how that, even though you're experiencing what you believe is a kind of comfort in that area, it's a very dangerous place to be, because you never
There's safety
then
that comes with that, because you know
absolutely,
you know what the dangers are. You know that this is how, like, it's your ego. Your ego is wired to keep your brain alive, and so it doesn't like change because it likes knowing all the variables right now, even if those variables are a bad job that doesn't pay the bills. But knowing how the world works is a very solidifying feeling, and the more you solidify with that thought, the more you can just accept. And within the American culture, this is something that we don't often slow down, but it really smacked people in the face when the pandemic hit. Consumerism requires us to stay in patterns. It requires us to believe we need a Target run every weekend to stay happy.
There's a very important nuance between nostalgia for, how it used to be when I had all of my friends, or in the case of the military, had all of my veteran brothers and sisters, helping in something important. Is there a way to determine when nostalgia becomes you're starting that feedback loop in pulling away from society, and does that in some way add to the depression? I guess what I'm asking is this something that veterans have to be aware of when that nostalgia becomes, this is now depression in a sense?
Yeah, I think and that's why I love that question about like whether or not a thought is helpful as opposed to realistic, right? Because I think there are some folks who can have the same thought of, I'm a better version of myself when I'm around other people, or when I was around these people, right? And for some folks, like that can be a thought that sparks, oh, okay, well now what I need to do is I've got to find other like-minded people, in my current context, and take advantage of that. But there's other people who might say, well, I can't be happy until I get back, until I get back to that. And I think that second person is somebody who's going to be more likely to develop, a depressive reaction.
I had a big meeting with my agents. They were like, DC, what do you want? I was like, you guys do a great job for me. I'm humble. DC, what do you want? What kind of roles? I'm like, you guys do a great job for me. And this one phrase changed my life. Lena said, this was in January, said, DC, what is your bucket list? And I was like, oh, that's a different question, right? I said, I want to be in The Mandalorian. I want to be in the Star Wars universe, live action or animation. And then, this was right before the press release. I dropped that press release on a Wednesday of the Super Bowl. The next day, I get a call from the Dan Patrick Show. The Dan Patrick Show says, we need y'all on Super Bowl Friday. I'm on the Dan Patrick Show national TV Super Bowl Friday because of a press release, right? And not only that, you have to let people see you hustle.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm on the national TV, and I'm like, yeah, I'm working on being in The Mandalorian and the Star Wars universe. So George Lucas and Dave Filoni, if you're listening, you need to come holler at me. Now, I don't expect nothing of that, but I threw it out there because you never know. It might be somebody like, hey, man, the scoop there, the Sprinkles guys was talking about wanting to be in The Mandalorian. And Jon Favreau, my kids love that commercial. Call his agent. You never know how it's going to happen, but you can go through these scenarios in your head, and then that makes it worth it to throw it out there. And then I also knew that Geico's listening because this was big. And they got to make sure that we don't mess up their brand by talking stupid, right? And I'm like, okay, let me see how much they really listen. I said, yeah, we're about to do a serious tag team challenge on TikTok. So be listening for it, everybody. 2 days later, hey, DC, yeah, Gaka wanted to know what that tag team TikTok challenge is all about. They want to get behind that. You listening? Now I get to impose my will. Now it's about my creativity. Now I get to influence. I get to inspire. I get to let them see me hustle.
And so, absolutely, like you, I encourage people to not simply read, but reread. And, you know, this kind of maybe brings us into the next kind of question I have here. I'm curious about another thread that I found in your podcast. That thread being an appreciation for order and discipline. And I'm wondering, what's the connection there between kind of the language, order, and discipline as you see it?
Sure. Yeah. And I'm glad that you picked up on that, because it's not something that I even necessarily know how that became a thread. It's interesting,
Sure.
You know, in the podcast evolution, how you find your voice and kind of find the rhythm of things. And you're right, that has emerged. And when I go back, when I have the time and listen to older episodes, which is a challenging thing to do as you get deeper into it, you go back and listen with horror at some of the things that the early days, as it were. But you're right, there is a certain amount of, you know, order and discipline that I think comes from that. And there's a self-improvement piece that is tucked into almost every episode, because those words clearly stood out. I used to call it my leadership quote book, because it was designed to kind of enhance my leadership. It was lessons learned and words captured from people who I admired, or at least felt challenged by as a leader. So the idea there, I guess you could, the rudimentary way to look at it would be, well, it clearly traces back to the fact that, you know, Marines and people in the military in general tend to be fairly ordered and fairly disciplined. So that must be why. But what I really think it is more so for me is that life is a challenge. From the moment we wake up, we're inundated with information. We are forced to make decisions. I had a guest on recently that referenced and said the average person makes 35,000 decisions in a day. Some of them are significant. Some of them are relatively insignificant. But that's a lot of a requirement on a person, on the mental capacity of a person. And life is hard. And then you mix in all the challenges of, you know, spouses and children and coworkers and friends and family that you have to interact with. And you have to navigate all of those things. And it can feel very disordered as a result of that. It can feel very chaotic. And it's the type of thing that has, you know, causes people to need to talk to someone, to have, you know, whether it be a therapist or a close friend or something, to try to sort out the madness. And I think when you hear words, especially historical words, when we look back at Mark Twain and Benjamin Franklin and other historical figures throughout time, and you get the richness of the context from the words that they said, because you understand, at least what I hope to do is to deliver the context of those words so that people understand that the founding fathers, or, you know, the Homers of the world, as far back as you can go, their lives were complicated too. They were people that were challenged. And yet, in the midst of all of that difficulty and challenge and disorder and seeming chaos, emerges these iconic phrases that drift through time, perpetuated and handed off generation to generation, and then land in my lap, and then land on the podcast, and land in somebody else's ears. And to me, it shows the humanity of these great enlightened thinkers whose names a lot of times you only see attached to a colorful background with colorful words, that little, you know, the dash and then that person's name. And you think, this person had it figured out. This person got it. But what you don't realize is that chaos and disorder and challenge have existed since time immemorial, and they sorted through it the way that we are. So in drawing from their words, I think it helps me find a certain sense of that order and discipline that you referenced.
Most people don't understand the butterfly effect. The point of the butterfly effect is not that little things have big consequences. It's that we cannot determine how those little things will interact to make big consequences. So, and this is true, and this is kind of mind-boggling. We could put sensors around the entire Earth, every foot squared, up through the stratosphere. And we would still only be able to predict the weather up to 2 weeks away. Because the differences, the minor fluctuations in between the sensors within a foot of space would ultimately create, mathematically, would create vastly different results over at a certain point. I don't know if that made sense. Should I try and say it again? Or
yeah, no. The idea is there's only, again, it kind of actually circles back even to Job, because the idea is there's only so much that you can know as it is over a certain period of time, and so much that you can predict. My brother-in-law is actually actually predicts the weather for the National Weather Service, and of course we always joke with him, about how people are saying, how could they be wrong so many times? But in actuality, it has to do with what you're talking about, that there's only so many data points that you can even use or have access to be able to predict. And then, of course, those data points can switch at a given moment, and that can change the entire model for the weather for the next day even, or even the day of.
And that's what people don't realize about life. And that's where I think the whole chasing Leviathan makes sense. At any moment, I could find a detail that is just really problematic that forces me to reevaluate everything. And so that's like, even as we're talking about individual suffering, and it's better than it's ever been before, there's value in that. I do believe that. But I don't want, we cannot discount the reality of details. And ultimately, if you get too systemic, eventually your system will get flipped. And that's because you get caught thinking a certain way.
You made me think about Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, and how you've got both Frodo and Samwise Gamgee returning from this conflict of trying to bring the ring, right, to Mount Doom and destroy it. And at one point, and this again stuck with me when I reread it about 2 or 3 years ago now, was just what made Samwise able to come back home and rejoin civilization was his complete and utter belief in the home, in the structure that's there. And you might even say, we could certainly talk about how both of them are going to have certain problems, right? Because you had just mentioned that can also lead to potential distortions as well, because the home, of course, is never the same completely when you come back. But it's such a strong thing for him to have to believe it when he's away, that there is a home and that I am still a part of it, and that I need to be there. Whereas with Frodo, of course, he comes back, he's forever changed by his experience, and he just basically flat out says, this home is not here for me anymore. And both of them you have to be so careful about when you're talking about real problems, right? You never want... There are a lot of veterans, I would assume, who come home feeling like Frodo and say, this home was not preserved for me anymore. And we have to help them and tell them, no. There is a home here for you. Absolutely. And you are very much a part of it, but also helping those who want to keep that image, like Sam, to say, don't expect it to be exactly the same, but understand that you do still want to believe that there's a structure there of support and love and whatnot. And it's just, I hadn't thought about it again until both of you just mentioned it, but it's very strong to me. Absolutely.
Well,
I could see the fight.
Can I add something?
Please, of course. Yes.
So for Frodo, I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. And, Tolkien is the great classicist and all that. So, of course, I would love the Lord of the Rings. However, what I wanted to say is that for Frodo also he's come away with a measure of shame over his behavior.
Yes.
He wasn't able to resist the power of the ring. And therefore, that feeling of shame, one of the things, Bridget, and you've experienced this, we, as the community that needs to welcome the veteran home again, we have to make space for them to be able to grapple with that shame. because that was something that they took on our behalf. All right. They are totally set up to be like, you're going to defend this, that, and the third about the United States. And so when the veteran returns, because there's probably been some shameful acts that will have occurred, depending on how the veteran responds to that, they may need more help from the community. Frodo got no help when he went home. There wasn't somebody saying, let's have a giant party to welcome you back. He just sort of kind of slid into things, still with this degree of shame embedded in his personality. So I'm not surprised that he found it really hard to stay at home, where Samwise didn't have to struggle with that. So similarly, we could look at that as something called a moral injury, as a play out of a moral injury. So at our VA in Philadelphia, the Christians VA Medical Center, we have a moral injury group that is really working hard to not only help the veteran understand like their service, but to encourage the community to take upon itself a real ceremony that enables that veteran to return to the community, to not be divested of the shame, but to certainly have that shame or the acts that they witnessed or perpetrated or whatever, to have those things be in a perspective.
If I could just throw something in, and I've taken part in one of these ceremonies, and they're incredibly. It was a really powerful, moving experience. And I think that this involvement of civilians in these ceremonies speaks to one of the most important differences between the ancient world and the modern world, which is that in the ancient world, every man of a certain age participated in the military. It pervaded the society, and everyone was involved in war. And we now live in such a different society where we kind of outsource that to a very small proportion of the population. And we send those people to do things in our name that we don't always own. And so I think a program like that is really important. And dialogues like the ones that we have in Eternal Soldier between people who have served and people who haven't are really, really important.
One thing you mentioned before that I've talked about even with other people as well is this idea of the collection, the data part. And this is a very straightforward question to you. Do we undervalue the importance of our private data?
Yeah, by a lot. I mean, the short answer is yes, we undervalue that because it is big business, and there are a lot of people making a lot of money on you right now. As you are listening to this episode in your app, data is being collected about you. And it may seem in like individual drops, like it's not much, but there was do you remember on Facebook here several months back, there was a lot of stuff spreading about answer these 10 questions. 99% of people can't do it. And it was stupid stuff like, what was your first dog? Or, what was your first car? Or what was the name of your grandpa? And a lot of people would be like, don't answer those questions. They're trying to scrape security questions from you. And the thing about that was like a trial run. There are now bot algorithms running on Facebook actively right now that are sharing things that are much less insidious, much harder to pick out. And what they're doing is they're asking you to, maybe answer a question or something like this. And it's not like a security question, obviously. It's like, if you're baking a cake, what's the one ingredient you can't do without? And it's like, that doesn't seem weird. But when you look at engagement numbers on them and how Facebook measures engagement, what they're doing is they are building entire sentiment profiles on people. And what you react to, even without commenting, just by clicking that like button and choosing one of the little icons, they're collecting sentiment data. They're saying what you will and won't react to. What kind of posts do you click on? What kind of posts do you answer things on? What do you say? We've now got enough machine learning that the way you word things can be used to determine what kind of individual you are. Are you a liberal? Are you a conservative? They can tell without asking you political questions now. And that stuff is going somewhere. Somebody is paying a lot of money for a lot of very high-tech stuff to be done. And not knowing what's going to come from that is a scary thing to me about the future of web and what it means, because what it ends up doing is sentiment is used against you. Your preferences are used against you. Remember, I said tools like Instagram are designed to keep you staring at Instagram. And it, right now, that just means, they're just showing you ads. And they're getting very good at showing you ads. There is another dark pattern that's literally called disguised ads. This is like and we've seen this in the print world, in the television world for years, right? Advertainment. And this need to disclose when something is a sponsored segment in news and things like this. There's very little of that going on in the web. And so stuff is constantly getting shown to you based on all these things. One of the big things that came out of that last election cycle, and people talk about what Russia did with Facebook and all of that, and people have oversimplified that and are like, well, Russia didn't manipulate any votes, they didn't do this. No, they didn't. But what they did was they got smart enough and learned from Cambridge Analytica which states they could move numbers in just enough that they don't have to influence 1 million votes. They need to influence 10,000 votes in just the right area and use those sentiment profiles to make sure they're feeding the right advertisements in those areas. And some of those advertisements were scary. I was researching them at the time. Like, there was some weird stuff happening. And some of it, I couldn't even begin to explain to you what its purpose was. But it was handcrafted to target those levers and those pain points. Man, it's spooky, and don't even take me down the rabbit hole of deep fakes, because it gets worse.
The yes men who have come around so much, which do you think came first here? Kind of a chicken and egg question here. Is it that the entertainers might have wanted them and that fed it, or do you think it was something about the culture of the representation, the yes men culture, that fed into the entertainers?
I think it's both, I think that a lot of entertainers, they just want to, people say, oh, you're great all day. And they tell the athletes how great they are, all day. And instead of telling them, you got to be truthful, telling them the truth. I mean, every day you read about another athlete, and, just finished reading this, about this sad situation in Las Vegas with this ball player. I mean, and, and if his representation would have said to him, listen, stop drinking. You can't be going out at night at 3 o'clock in the morning and partying. And someone would have told him that instead of just taking his money, and, so people would be alive today. So I was always the type of, when I was an agent for my athletes or and my entertainers, I really told them the truth, and I'd say, hey, save your money. It's going to end. So stop spending like this. And I'm thank God with all my clients today. I talk to all my athletes. I put them in. I never did their investments, but I'd recommend them that they should be careful to save, because the day is going to end. And there are a lot of people in the entertainment business and the sports business who encourage their people, spend money, it's okay. It keeps them working, especially so many entertainers. Can I buy a house? Yeah, buy this house for $8 million. Yeah, buy this house. It's okay. With the reasoning behind it is now they're going to have to go keep working to pay it off, and I'm going to make more commissions, and I'm going to keep them on the road. And so that's really what I meant in the film, is just learning to be honest with these people. And here I was, a young guy, and I'm 20 years old, 21, and I'm dealing with professional athletes, and 25 dealing with rock stars, and 30 years old dealing with a Beatle, and just learning how to talk to people and just be honest with them.
How were you able to escape?
Well, different ways. So in my personal case, it's kind of a longer story, but I'll try to make it quick. We had a Russian maid, we meaning my grandparents, my grandparents spent a lot of time in Russia before the war. They had business in Russia. So they had this maid who was basically part of the family. They only spoke Russian with her, and she lived with them. She had her own room, and yeah. So when the order came that all Jews had to move into the Jewish section, that same order also specified that any Gentiles had to move out of the ghetto. And the young lady, her name was Juliana, refused to move out. She said that my grandparents were the only family she ever had. She was very interested in Russian culture, obviously, since she only spoke Russian. And one of the smart things she did before the war was the only center for Russian culture in Warsaw, really, at that time, was maintained by something called the White Russians. These were refugees from the Russian Revolution. And the Germans cultivated them because they were hoping that once they conquered Russia, that these people would become their puppets in running the Russian country. So they had quite a bit of favor with the Nazi regime. So Juliana went to them and she said that she told her story and she threatened to commit suicide if she couldn't stay with us. So they gave her 2 permits. The first one was to go in and out of the ghetto, which was, the first one was to stay in the ghetto, so she could stay with us. But the second permit was even more important, which was that she could go in and out, which basically saved our life, because it meant that she could take valuables like clothing, jewelry, and just put them on her person and take them outside and trade them for food and then bring food back to us. So we never really starved. We were really very fortunate in that we had a nice apartment and we had food. So we were among the very privileged residents of the Warsaw Ghetto. In the summer of 1942, when the roundups happened, when they started rounding up people from their homes in the street for the transport by cattle cars to the gas chambers of Treblinka, she was out on one of her runs and she got caught up, and she was basically barely able to extricate herself, even with all her White Russian permits. When she finally got home, my grandmother, who ran the household, decided that things were getting too dangerous and that Juliana had to leave. And there was a lot of crying and screaming. And finally, Juliana agreed to leave, but only on one condition, which is to take me with her as her son so that I would live. And my grandparents had some jewelry, which was very fortunate. They made up 3 little piles of jewelry. One was for Juliana to give to the guard at the gate. So they knew her, but all of a sudden she had a 10-year-old son. The second batch was for the hooligans, the Polish hooligans who were gathering outside the ghetto gates so they could basically hold up escaping Jews. And the third one was for Juliana so she could start a new life outside the ghetto.
What I hope I've shown in this first season is that we have so much more that unites us as a people than divides us. If we can continue to meet on neutral ground, we can heal the growing divide between us and beat back into the void the real enemy of us all: cynicism. The world will always try to convince us that there's too much hate, too much politics, too much that exposes just how different we really are, and that we need to pick a side of the extreme, or we run the risk of being left to fend for ourselves, alone and vulnerable. Don't listen to the people in the extremes. The truth is, they need to yell. They need the hate. They need to keep us divided and on teams, because that's the only connection that they have left to humanity. It's the only way that they can feel anything. It's a story as old as human time itself. Don't believe the lies. You don't have to pick sides and bury yourself in debates that only waste the precious time that we have. Quality time, loving each other, reinforcing the human spirit, and creating good in the world around us. Because that is how we come together in the end, by creating good for each other. That cannot happen if we only ever live on one side of the extreme. And so, for the last time of 2021, I'll leave you with the following words. Try to keep one foot firmly planted on neutral ground, and have a great day.